Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Netillas Yadayim, and Emir Hashem, in today's share, we will complete Daf Nun Hey Amud Beis, and we will get into Daf Nun Vav Amud Aleph. So we've got plenty to do. I'd like to try to cover some ground. So without further ado, let's begin. We pick up on Nun Hey Amud Beis, Siman Kuf Samach Aleph, in the midst of Sif Aleph. We're 3 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch on Nun Hey Amud Beis, right by the words of the Ramah Hagah. Now, in order to understand this Ramah, which is a very cryptic Ramah, the words of the Ramah are a little bit vague, and we really have to try to figure out what the Ramah means and read into it between the lines. In order to understand the Ramah, we need a little bit of a recap of what we learned in the Mechaber yesterday. So, we're talking about the halachas of chatzitza when it comes to Netillas Yadayim. What constitutes a chatzitza? What constitutes a problematic interposition between the water of the Netillas Yadayim and the surface of your hands? So, one of the klalim, one of the rules that we've learned is that if you have something on your hands and it's only covering a minority portion of the area of your hand that needs to be washed for Netillas Yadayim, that still could be a chatzitza. What's that case? If we have a miyut umakpid, if we have a small chatzitza, meaning a chatzitza that's only covering a small portion, a minority portion of the surface of the hand that needs Netillas Yadayim, but it's a miyut umakpid. It's something that you do not want on your hands. It's something that you want to remove, or at least it's something that you often would remove from your hands. Maybe it's something that you have on your hands sometimes, and at other times you're makpid to remove it. But if you have something on your hand where it's miyut umakpid, that would make a chatzitza. Now, the Mechaber gave us examples of chatzitzas that are miyut umakpid. So, for example, the Mechaber told us that if you have tsaya tachas hatziporen, and remember we said that normally the normal translation of tsaya is excrement. Over here we're not translating tsaya as excrement. Tsaya means dirt. So if you have tsaya tachas hatziporen, if you have dirt under the fingernails, so the Mechaber told us it depends where that dirt is. If it's kineged habasar, if it's down in the crevice between the actual flesh of the fingertip and the nail, so that's miyut ve'enoi makpid. People are not always makpid. You don't have people walking around constantly with a toothpick or some device cleaning out their fingernails because they're completely makpid that there should be absolutely no dirt in the crevice between the fingertip and the fingernail. So if the tsaya is kineged habasar, if it's down in the crevice over there, that's miyut ve'enoi makpid. It's a very small amount of dirt on the hand that needs Netillas Yadayim. It's by far and away, it's a miyut, and it's enoi makpid. Miyut ve'enoi makpid does not make a chatzitza. But the Mechaber said, if you have tsaya tachas hatziporen sheloi kineged habasar, if you have long nails and you have dirt under the fingernail on the area of the fingernail where it protrudes beyond the fingertip, that's miyut umakpid. That's derech roiv b'nei adam, is that when they go to wash their hands, they want to take that dirt off. So dirt that's under the fingernail, shaloi kineged habasar, that's miyut umakpid, and that would make a chatzitza. That's what the Mechaber told us yesterday. Now, over there we were discussing soya tachas hatziporen, dirt under the fingernail. Now comes along the Ramah and says the Ramah like this, 3 lines down. And I got to tell you, when I first learned this Ramah, I was very, very, very tired. And I was looking at this Ramah, and I could not discern what the Ramah was saying. Trying to trying to reconcile the Ramah with the Mechaber. Is the Ramah arguing on the Mechaber? Is he agreeing with the Mechaber? And then, when I looked at it again later when I was awake, I realized the basic mistake that I was making. Let's take a look here at the words of the Ramah. It says the Ramah Haga, Umishum hachi. Because of this, what does that mean? Because of this halacha that we just learned in the Mechaber, where we see that miut umakbid is a chatzitza, miut ve'ena makbid is not a chatzitza, and we learned about dirt under the fingernails. Umishum hachi, says the Ramah, Loi nagu l'naker hatit. We are not noyig to take out tit. Now, he does not say tsoya. See, the Mechaber was talking about tsoya tachas hatziporin, which we translated as dirt underneath the fingernail. What kind of dirt? It's the natural occurring dirt. Like the Mishnah Berurah told us, hazuama. Zuama satzi parnayim shederech lihi kavetz sham. It's the normal, natural occurring dirt that builds up under the cuticles. That's the dirt that the Mechaber was talking about. That's not what the Ramah is talking about. The Ramah doesn't use the same phraseology. The Ramah says, says the Ramah, we're not noyig to dig out the mud that gathers under the nail, linetila, before we watch Netillas Yadayim. Why? Mishum dehevikimiyutai she'enoi makbid. Because that is also considered miut ve'enoi makbid, ki ein makpidim al zen linetila. Because people are not makbid to dig that out, and therefore it's not a problem for Netillas Yadayim. Now, there are different ways to learn this Ramah, but this is a Mishnah Berurah shir. So we're going to learn the Ramah the way the Mishnah Berurah learns it, the way the Mishnah Berurah brings from the Magen Avram. What the Mishnah Berurah says in the name of the Magen Avram is, the Ramah means like this. The Mechaber was talking about tsoya tachas hatzi parnayim. The Ramah comes to address the question of tit tachas hatzi parnayim. The Mechaber, right before this Ramah, spoke about two types of tit, two types of mud. Tit hayovein, which we said is mud that comes from a pit, which is exceptionally dense, so water cannot penetrate it, and it's also very sticky, so it sticks to the hands and the water won't get under it. V'tit hayotzrim, and also clay, the type of tit, the type of mud that pottery makers use, which is also exceptionally dense and exceptionally sticky. Now comes along the Ramah, and the Ramah says, what if you get tit hayovein, or tit hayotzrim? What if you get this kind of mud, tachas hatzi parnayim? What's the din then? Says the Ramah, I'll tell you what the din is. The din is that tit hayovein and tit hayotzrim, tachas hatzi parnayim, has the same exact din that the Mechaber said about tsoya tachas hatzi parnayim. You might have thought that tit hayovein or tit hayotzrim tachas hatzi parnayim is worse than tsoya tachas hatzi parnayim. Now, why would you think that? Well, what did the Mechaber tell us yesterday? Yesterday, the Mechaber told us that tsoya tachas hatzi parnayim, if it's kineged abasar, it's not a problem, because it's miut ve'enoi makbid. If it's shaloi kineged abasar, it is a problem because it's miut umakbid. But then the Mechaber told us, how about butzeik? How about dough? A woman is kneading dough, and she gets butzeik under her fingernails. Butzeik is a foreign substance. That's not naturally occurring dirt. By butzeik, the Mechaber told me that butzeik is a problem. It is a chatzitza, even if it's kineged abasar. So tsoya tachas hatzi parnayim is not a problem, kineged abasar. But butzeik tachas hatzi parnayim, that's a problem, even if it's kineged abasar. Now, you might have drawn a conclusion, and it seems a very logical conclusion. If butzeik is a problem, tachas hatzi parnayim kineged abasar, because it's miut umakbid, then maybe tit hayovein and tit hayotzrim is also a problem kineged hatzi parnayim because it's miut umakbid. Says the Ramah, no. The Ramah says that Tita Yavein and Tita Yotzrim, as long as it's Kineged Abasar, it has the same din as Tsaya Takasetzi Parnayim Kineged Abasar. If it's Kineged Abasar, it's Miyat Ve'enoi Makbid, and it's not a Chatzitza. If it's Shaloi Kineged Abasar, if it's under the fingernail where the fingernail protrudes beyond the fingertip, then it's Miyat Makbid, and it is a problem. Now, why is it that the Ramah is drawing a distinction between Tita Yavein, Tita Yotzrim, that are Takas Etzi Parnaim Kineged Abasar, and Botzek, that's Takas Etzi Parnaim Kineged Abasar? I don't know. That I can't tell you. I'm not sure. But this is how the Magen Avram learns the Ramah. So again, the Ramah says, Haga, Umishum Hachi, because of this concept that you can have Miyut Ve'enoi Makbid, and then it's Chatzitz, it's not a problem. And we see that the Mechaber said that Soya Takas Etzi Parnayim, if it's Kineged Abasar, is not a problem because it's Miyut Ve'enoi Makbid. Umishum Hachi, says the Ramah, Loi Nagu L'Naker Atitcha Takas Etzi Parnayim L'Netila. Therefore, we're not noyig to have to dig out Tita Yavein or Tita Yotzrim that are Takas Etzi Parnayim Kineged Habasar, Mishum Dev Kimyutay Sheina Makbid, because that's considered Miyat Ve'ena Makbid. Kein Makpidim Al Zel L'Netila, because we're not Makbid on that, so that we should have to dig it out before Netilas Yadayim. That's what the words Kein Makpidim Al Zel L'Netila mean, according to this pshat. Continues the Ramah, skip the parentheses here until the bottom of the line, till the bottom line. Avalim Hoya Makbid. But let's say somebody has Tita Yavein, Tita Yotzrim, Takas Etzi Parnayim, even Kineged Abasar, and he is Makbid, Hu Tzarich L'Nakron. Then he has to dig it out, because it's a Miyut Makbid. V'chein Iker. And that is the Iker Halacha, so says the Ramah. Now the Ramah closes out the Sif with what is a very difficult sentence to understand. And interestingly enough, the Chavetz Chaim did not tackle it at all. There's no Mishnah Berurah on it. Says the Ramah, Ve'efsher shenagu lahakal b'chatzitza le'inyan netila. You have, the way I'm understanding this is, you have this open question in the words of the Ramah. How is the Ramah drawing a distinction between Botzek Takas Etzi Parnayim Kineged Abasar, where the Mechaber says that is a Chatzitza because it's Miyut Makbid. And then you have Tit Takas Etzi Parnayim Kineged Abasar, where the Ramah says it's not a Chatzitza because it's Miyut Ve'enoi Makbid. What's the difference? Says the Ramah, Ve'efsher shenagu lahakal b'chatzitza. It's possible that we're noyig to rule leniently when it comes to shilas of chatzitzas on the hands by Netilas Yadayim. Why? Ki yesh oimrim she'ein shai chatzitza l'netila. Because guess what? There's a shitas rishonim that holds that there really is no halacha of chatzitza when it comes to Netilas Yadayim. Now, exactly what that means is beyond the scope of this shir. Obviously, if you would put on gloves and you would wash the Netilas Yadayim, even this shita the rishonim would hold, you're not yotzei Netilas Yadayim. You didn't wash your hands. You washed latex gloves. But there is a shita sarishonim that says that the halakas of chatzitza do not really apply to the Netilas Yadayim. Why? Sugi and chulin, because when the Gemara says that Netilas Yadayim is like tfilas haguf, it doesn't mean l'inyan chatzitza, it means l'inyan other halachas. But there is such a shita rishonim. So the efshe shenagu lahachal b'chatzitza, maybe bechlal when it comes to chatzitzas l'inyan netila by Netilas Yadayim, ki yesh oimrim shein shai chatzitza l'netila. Because there are those that say that there's no halacha of chatzitza by Netilas Yadayim. Aval ikar kisvara rishoina, but the ikar is like the svara harishona. So now let's see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Let's go back to Dunhei Amid Beis, 4 lines off the bottom of the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Tes Hatit. The Ramah said that we're not noyeg lenaker, we're not noyeg to dig out tit, mud, dirt that built up under the fingernails kineged habasar before Netilas Yadayim. HaMagid Avram Piresh, the Magid Avram explains this Ramah, de koi rak al shekineged abasar, where the Ramah means tit, that's takas atziparnayim kineged abasar, when it's all the way down in the crevice between the fingertip and the nail. Va'afilu titayavein va'yotzrim, even titayavein and titayotzrim that are exceptionally dense and exceptionally sticky, we're still not noig to dig that out if it's kineged abasar. Mishum de be'elu medinois ein makpidin al zeh, because he says in our regions people aren't makpid. Ve'eve kimiyuta sheina makpid. So this is miyut ve'ena makpid. It's not a chatzitza. Avol shaloi kineged abasar. But if somebody would have titayavim, titayotzrim, tachas atziparnayim shaloi kineged abasar, then that would be a problem. Bevadai roiv b'nei adam makpidin. That the majority of people definitely are makpid. Afilu b'tzaya. Forget titayave and titayotzrim. Even if you have tzaya, even if you have dirt, naturally occurring dirt under the fingernail, shaloi kineged abasar, that the Mechaber told us is a problem. V'chaitzitz av shuhu ein makpid. And that would be a chatzitza even if you have one slovenly individual who happens not to be makpid on his dirty fingernails. Doesn't matter. It's a chatzitza for the Netillas Yadayim anyway, because roiv b'nei adam are makpid. The Chidvarav Ha'etiku HaChayadam, the Chayadam writes like this Magid Avram, V'aderech HaChayim, so to the Derech HaChayim. But the Mishnah Berurah ends off this Mishnah Berurah and he says, V'yeshem akilin b'tzaya ustam tit. There are those who take this kula of the Ramah even further, and they say that their makel, even by tzaya and regular mud, not titayavein and titayotzrim, their makel, if it's takas atziparnayim, even shaloi kineged abasar, they're makel and they say it's not a chatzitza. Ois kat yud, if you have an individual who is makpid who, mashma, the implication of the Ramah is, alpha pisha roiv einon makpidim, even though most people are not makpid, kevin dehu makpid, since this individual is makpid, as linon basrei, the halakha follows his own peculiarities, the chaitzis, and it becomes a chatzitza, because for him it's a miyut makpid. But the Chavetz Chaim says it would seem that that's only by a type of chatzitza that's really problematic, like titayotzrim or caked up mud, but by regular mud, which is very moist, afar, or just like dirt, loose dirt, shatachas hatziparin kineged abasar, she'ena nidbak kol kach, it's not so sticky, the water could penetrate it, ein lahachmer, you shouldn't be machmer. Ubefratim kol hayoyim ein darka lahakbid, rak kishemagiel l'netila. Certainly, if you have somebody who has dirt under his fingernails, kineged abasar, and he's b'chalal not makbid about it, and the only time he ever thinks about it is when he goes to wash the Netillas Yadayim. So if it's only a hakpada for the Netillas Yadayim, it's not a hakpada, right? So in that case, you definitely do not have to be machmer. Okay, moving on to Sif Bey's 2 lines from the top on Nun Vav Amud Aleph in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, Kol davar she'enoi makbid alav enoi chaitzitz. Anytime you have some sort of a chatzitza on your hand, which is a miyut, when it's only on a minority portion of the hand, and you're not makbid, so again, we have to kind of like insert a word over here in the words of the Mechaber. The Mechaber literally says, Kol davar she'enoi makbid, whenever you're not makbid on something, it's not a chatzitza. Well, that's not true. Because if it's roiv, if it's covering roiv of the hand, if it's ruba ve'enoi makbid, that is a chatzitza. Because remember, it has one of the variables that make up a chatzitza midaraisa. It has roiv. And as long as you have one of the variables that make up a chatzitza midaraisa, you have a chatzitza. So roiv ve'enoi makbid is a chatzitza. What does the Mechaber mean when he says if you're not makbid, it's not a chatzitza? That's when you're talking about a miyut. Miyuta ve'enoi makbid is not a chatzitza. So kol davar she'enoi makbid alav, whenever you have something that's only covering a minority, a miyut of the hand, and you're not makbid on it, enoi chaitzitz, that is not a chatzitza. Okay, now says the Mechaber, how do you judge? What if you have a situation where one person is makpid on a certain type of chatzitza, and another person is not makpid on that type of chatzitza? Is it considered a chatzitza or is it not considered a chatzitza? Says the Mechaber, Hayadarko shel zel hakpid, if it's the derech of one person to be makpid on a certain type of chatzitza, v'zeh ein darka lahakpid, and another person, he's not makpid on that type of chatzitza. What's the halacha? Says the Mechaber, L'misha darka lahakpid, for the person who's makpid, chaitzitz, it's a chatzitza. L'misha ein darka lahakpid, for the person who it's his derech not to be makpid, ein chaitzitz, for him it's not a chatzitza. Ketzad, what's a case? What's a case where we can apply this? Says the Mechaber, like this. Hayayechad saba, if one person is a dyer, his job is to dye clothing. So he's working with colored dyes all the time. V'hayu yadav tzevuais. So his hands are dyed. This guy is all day long, he works dyeing fabrics purple. So guess what? He has purple hands. So if somebody is a dyer, and because he's a dyer, he always has purple hands, ein hatzeva chaitzitz al yadav. For him, the purple dye does not create a chatzitza. He's not makpid. Now, a normal person, if he's walking out the street with purple hands, you bet he's makpid. He goes home and he washes his hands to get the purple off. But a guy who that's his career, he's doing it for 20 years, he's dyeing fabrics purple, yeah, his hands are purple. Somebody will stop. Why is that guy's hands purple? Oh, you don't know? He's the dyer. That's why his hands are purple. So that guy's not makpid. So therefore, for him, the purple dye, I'm just picking on the color purple, for him, the dye is not a chatzitza. And says the Mechaber, this is true, this is true even though we're not just talking about that the skin of his hand is discolored and it's colored purple, but there's no mamoshus, there's no actual substance of dye on his hand. It's just a discoloration. No, what we're talking about is this is not a chatzitza for the fellow who's not makpid, even though there is actual substance of dye on his hand. So it's a real chatzitza. It's not just a discoloration. It's a real chatzitza. Now, so that's for a person who's a dyer. So again, so what did the Mechaber say here so far? The Mechaber has established that the question of whether something is considered a chatzitza because you're makpid on it, or it's not considered a chatzitza because it's miyut ve'enoi makpid, is going to be determined by the individual. The case that the Mechaber is giving me to illustrate this is the case of a dyer. So you have one guy who's a dyer, you have one guy who's not a dyer. Now, the guy who's a dyer has been dyeing fabrics purple for the last 20 years. The guy who's not a dyer has never worked with dye in his life. But he was curious one day what his friend does for a living, so he came in during his lunch break and he helped his friend out with the dye, and because of that he got purple hands. At the end of the day, we've got two people here who both have purple hands. Ruvain is the dyer, he has purple hands. Shimon is the guy who tried dyeing for a day, he also has purple hands. They both want to go wash the Netillas Yadayim to eat their tuna for sandwiches. They don't have the same halacha. Ruvain, who's a dyer, he's not makpid on the purple hands. So for him, it's miyut ve'enoi makpid. But for Shimon, who's not a dyer, he just tried it for an hour, he's miyut makpid. So for him, the purple dye is a chatzitza. Now says the Mechaber, but realize, we're talking when there's mamoshus. We're talking when there's actual substance of the dye. So for Ruvain, even though there's substance, it's still not considered to be a chatzitza, because it's miyut ve'enoi makpid. But for Shimon, it is a chatzitza. Says the Mechaber weiter, Loi hayatzaba, the Shimon, who's not a dyer, im hayu yadav tzvuais, if his hands are dyed, v'yesh mamish hatzeva al yadav, and the dye has substance, harei zeh chaitzis, then that makes a chatzitza for Shimon. Now, what we're saying over here is, again, two different distinctions. One distinction is Reuven is a dyer, so for him it's miyat ve'ena makbid. Shimon's not a dyer, for him it's miyat makbid. Therefore, they have two different halachas. But there's another distinction between the lines here in the Mechaber, and that is that even for Shimon, it's only a chatzitza if the dye is substantive. If it's just a discoloration of the skin, and there's no substance to the dye, then it's not a chatzitza. And the Mechaber backs that up. The Mechaber says, Shahadiyoy hayavesh chaitzitz, because we know that when it comes to ink, if it's dry ink that has substance, that water cannot penetrate, chaitzitz, that makes a chatzitza. But v'halach, wet ink that's water soluble and is not substantive, ain't a chaitzitz, that doesn't make a chatzitza. Okay. You know what? Let's pause over here for a second, because the next line is kind of like an extrapolation of this halacha, and it's its own separate chiddush. So let's stop here for a second. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yud Aleph. Kol davar. So the opening salvo of Sif Beis was that anytime you have a chatzitza that's a miut, and it's einay makbid, it doesn't make a chatzitza. But the Mechaber didn't write that in his words. He didn't put in the words that he's talking about a miut. He didn't put that in. So says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cutting it off, kol davar hainu imhu b'miyutai dafka. When the Mechaber says anything that you're not makbid is not a chatzitza, well, that's not really true. If it would be roiv, it's a chatzitza even if you're in a makbid. It's only not a chatzitza because it's in a makbid if it's a miut. Avagav de kvar zakazeh Mechaber b'soif sif hakaitim. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, even though there's no chiddush in what the Mechaber just told me, the Mechaber just told me miut ve'enoi makbid is not a chatzitza. Well, guess what? Yesterday on Nun Hey Amud Beis, the Mechaber already told me that. The Mechaber told me on the second line down near the end of the line on Nun Hey Amud Beis, avo b'miyutay she'enoi makbid ein lachush. Miut ve'enoi makbid is not a chatzitza. So the Mechaber told me this halacha yesterday in Sif Aleph. I didn't need him to say it again here in Sif Beis, so the Chavetz Chaim explains why he did so. Even though the Mechaber already told me this halach in the previous Sif, he repeats it over here, because the truth is, this whole Sif Beis is taken verbatim from the Rashba. So he did a copy and paste. He took the whole Rashba. Mamish kamuva bebeis Yosef. It's divrei Rashba mamish. It's verbatim taken from the Rashba, as the Rashba is quoted in the Beis Yosef. So he wanted to mamish copy the Rashba's entire lashon. Ois cotton yud beis. If you have somebody who's a tzaba, you have somebody who's a dyer, v'hayu yadav tzvois, and now his hands are dyed. Says the Mishnah Berurah, a very important thing. The Mechaber told us, if you have a dyer and his hands are dyed, for him it's not considered a chatzitza. Why? Because it's a miut ve'ena makbid. But what if it would be roiv? What if the dyer, it's not that a miut of his hands have substantive dye on them. What if the dyer has substantive dye on roiv of his hands? So now it's true that it's eina makbid, but it's ruba ve'ena makbid. Ruba ve'ena makbid makes a chatzitza because it's roiv. Now, the Mechaber didn't make that distinction. So says the Mishnah Berurah over here, nice cut in your base, v'hayu yadav tzvuos, this halacha, that if the dyer has substantive dye on his hands, it's not a chatzitza, because for him it's miyat ve'ena makbid, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ritzayin Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, miktsas mimakam hanetila. That's only true if it's miut ve'ena makbid. If it's only a small portion of the hand that needs to be washed. Di'ilu hayarubai, because if we're talking about where it's roiv of his hands, hakaimelon da'afilu eina makbid chaitzitz. Ruba ve'ena makbid is a chatzitza. Achein, nevertheless, when we're going to get to the end of Sif Beis, the part of Sif Beis that I didn't read yet, achein, baseifa, at the end of Sif Beis, le'inyin nashim shedarkan litzpaya yadein l'noi. When the Mechaber is going to tell us the new halacha, the Mechaber is going to tell us that women, apparently, at some point in time, had the minig to dye their hands. Women nowadays put makeup on their faces. Guess what? Once upon a time, women put makeup on their hands and they dyed their hands a different color. So does that create a problem of a chatzitza for the Netillas Yadayim? The Mechaber says no. Now it's an astonishing chiddush. The chiddush over there is that even though it's roiv, that's what the Mishnah Berurah says over here. The Mishnah Berurah says over here, Baseifa in Yinashim Shadaka Litzpai Yadein L'nai. In the Seifa, the end of Sif Beis, when we're going to talk about women who color their hands for prettiness, Afilu Kol Yadein Tzvois Nami. Even if they dye their entire hand, it's not a chatzitza. Now, you're going to say, wait a second, why not? Why not? It's true that it's einoi makbid. It's true that they want the dye on their hands, so it's einoi makbid, but it's rubai ve'einoi makbid. L'cher rubai ve'einoi makbid makes a chatzitza. So how could it be that a woman dyes her whole hand with substantive dye, and yet it's not a chatzitza? The answer is, because by the woman, it's not rubai ve'einoi makbid. It's not that she's not makbid on the dye. She wants the dye. She put it there intentionally and she wants it to stay there. Now it becomes bottled to her hand. Now it's considered part of her guf. It's considered part of her hand. So over there, even if it's roiv, it's okay. So, okay. Over there, even if they dye their entire hand, it's still not a chatzitza. Why? Since they put this dye on intentionally, and they want it to be there. It's not einoi makbid. No, they want it to be there. It becomes mamish part of their hands, and it doesn't make a chatzitza. Ois cotton yud gimel. The Mechaber said that for the dyer, the substantive dye on a miyut of his hands is not a chatzitza. Ein hatzeva, the dye is not a chatzitza. V'chein, similarly, says the Chavetz Chaim, imu tabach, if you're talking about a butcher, v'yesh dam al yadav, and he has blood on his hands from kashering meat, and a chaitzis. The dam doesn't make a chatzitza, because he's not makbid. V'chein imaya moicha shuman, if he's a fat salesman, apparently there was such a thing. V'yesh shuman al yadav, and he has fat on his hands, and a chaitzis. It's not a chatzitza, because for him, it's miyat ve'ena makbid. Aval akesh shahaya mamoshes dvar be'elu al yadav, but if you have stam, a housewife, that shechted that is kashering a chicken, and she has blood on her hands, right? So for her, it's a miyut umakbid. She's not a butcher who's dealing in this all day and is not so makbid if there's a little blood on the hand. She's a housewife. She doesn't want to have blood on her hand, right? It's a funny way of saying things. She doesn't want blood on her hands, but in any case, it's what it is. So for her, it's miyut umakbid. So avalakashoy mamashis far be'elo yadav chaitzitz. Now the Mishnah Berurah says an interesting thing. Let's say you have somebody who's a butcher and he's a jack of all trades. He's a butcher, and when he trims the meat, he renders the fats, so he's also a moicher shuman. So now he's got two types of chatzitzis on his hands. So he has blood and fat on his hands. We could be makel that they're both not a chatzitza because they're both miyut ve'enoi makbid. Okay, going weiter in the Mechaber, in the Mishnah Berurah, I mean, the Mechaber told me, I said the Mechaber made two different distinctions over here. The Mechaber made one distinction between Ruvain, the dyer, and Shimon, who's not a dyer. So for Ruvain, who's a dyer, the dye on a miyut of his hands is miyut ve'ena makbid. For Shimon, who's not a dyer, it's miyut umakbid. The other distinction that the Mechaber made was, he said, we're talking about when the dye is substantive. And then the Mechaber said, Shehadiyaya yavesh chaitzitz. So the Mishnah Berurah explains what the intent of the Mechaber was. Diyai, when it's yavesh, when it's dry, it's a chatzitza. V'halach ene chaitzitz, when it's moist, it's not a chatzitza. Or it's what the Mechaber wants to say is, K'may hasam gabi diyai. Just like the halacha is by diyai, by ink. Shahalach eno chaitzis, that wet ink does not make a chatzitza. Mitam shenimche b'mayim, because it's water soluble. Umei hanetila magin legufay, and therefore the water could penetrate the wet ink and get to the skin, so it doesn't make a chatzitza. Huadin litzavayim, the same halacha that applies to ink applies to dye. Shehem k'moid yai, they're very similar to ink. Dafka shemamashay alav, the only time dye becomes a problem is when it's substantive. Ha'emein by mamish, but if there's no substance, rak chazusa shel tzeva ba'alma, is just a discoloration, ein shayach chatzitza. A mere discoloration of the skin does not make a chatzitza. A chatzitza is only when there's something substantive that makes it into position between the water and the skin. V'hu adin shachrurish she'ein ba'mamish, so to a blackening of the hands, if there's no substance, ein a chatzitza, it doesn't make a chatzitza. Umisha kaisiv tadir. Let's say you have a cipher, somebody who writes all the time. Afilu yesh b'mashish shel diyah yavesh al itzpa'isav, even if he has substantive dried ink on his fingers, and a chaitzis is not a chatzitza. Ta'arei ein darkel hakbet al zeh. Because even though he might not be a printer, but if he's writing constantly, so he's not makbid on a little dried ink on his hands. Somebody writes with a fountain pen, very often their fingertips get inky, and they're not so makbid. So that it's miyat ben makbid, even if it's substantive. Okay, now we have to go weiter in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber, we are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 lines up from the bottom here on Nun Vav Amud Aleph, near the beginning of the line, and we already introduced this halacha in the Mishnah Berurah. V'chein hanoshim shedarkon litzbaya yadayim lenoi. So too women who are in the habit of dyeing their hands, coloring their hands, lenoi, for beauty purposes, for cosmetic purposes, v'kayotza bazeh, or anything similar to that, ein oisay tzeva chaitzitz. That tzeva is not a chatzitza, even if it's substantive, and the Mishnah Berurah said, even if it's on roiv of the hands. Now, not everybody agrees with that. The Aruch HaShulchan says that if it's on roiv of the hands, it is a chatzitza, and I believe the Shulchan Arav says that way also. But the Chavetz Chaim says not that way. The Chavetz Chaim, we just learned, says, by the women who do it intentionally, even if it's on roiv of their hands, it's not a chatzitza, because they want it there. Continues the Shulchan Aruch in the Ramah. Gildei Maka Sha'al Yadav. The Mishnah Berurah learns that this means a scab. If somebody has a dried scab on his hands, im eina makbid alav, if he's not makbid on that scab to remove it, he's leaving it. He's letting the wound heal. So it formed a scab, and now he's going to let it heal. So if it's not makbid, einon chaytzitzin, because again, it's miyat ve'ena makbid. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Katan Tesvav, gildei maka, the scab of a wound. Says the Mishnah Berurah, hainu rir hayoytze min amaka. This is the moisture, the that's the word I'm looking for in English. The word is escaping me right now, but it's the moisture and the liquids that ooze out from a wound. So, for example, pus, maybe blood initially, and the blood, the pus, this is what crusts up and dries up and makes a scab. It dries up, v'nase glid, and it makes a skin, it makes a crust over the wound. Some say that this means some kind of a blister that dries up, and it forms a skin over it, v'yeshalav gilde. I'm not sure what that means. But in any case, it's some kind of a crust. So it's got tezayin, im eino makbid. If the person is not makbid, what does that mean? Im eino makbid lahasira imayal yodav, mipnei shehu mitztar b'netilasai. Apparently what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, sometimes somebody who has a wound that formed a scab will remove it because the Netillas Yadayim over it hurts. So in that case, he's makbid. So that would be miyat to makbid. But if he's not makbid, it's okay. Okay, let's go a little bit weiter over here. Sif Gimel in the Mechaber, a very interesting halacha, very much negeya halacha l'maisa all the time. Says the Mechaber, tzarich lahaser hatabas me'al yodoi. You need to remove a ring from your hand b'shas Netillas Yadayim when you wash Netillas Yadayim. And says the Ramah, va'afilu hu rafui. This is true even if the ring is loose, so that water could penetrate underneath the ring. And says the Ramah, va'afilu eina makbid alav b'shas netila. And you need to take the ring off, even though at the time of Netillas Yadayim you're not makbid. You don't mind if the ring stays there. You're not makbid on the ring. Still, you got to take it off. Why? Why? If it's miyat ve'eina makbid, why do you have to take it off? Why is it a chatzitza? Says the Ramah, hayil makbid alav b'shah she'oiseh melacha, because people are makbid to take off their rings when they do work, shelo yitanfu, so that the rings should not get dirty. Okay, what does this mean? Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ice cutting Yud Zayin. The Mechaber said, Tzarich lahaser hatabas me'al yodoi. You need to take off the rings. Says the Chavetz Chaim is cutting Yud Zayin, lahaser hatabas mishum chatzitza, because the ring is a chatzitza. And then the Ramah said that this is true even if the ring is loose, so that water gets under it. Now wait a second. If water gets under it, why is it a chatzitza? Excuse me. So says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting Yud Ches, va'afilu, even if it's loose, even though the water is going to get to the finger because it's going to go under the ring. Still, you should take off the ring. Because there's a concept, if we're going to say the halacha is that you could leave a ring on if it's loose, but you can't leave the ring on if it's tight. You know what's going to happen? You're going to have people running to the place like, is it loose? Is it tight? I don't know. I can't tell. You know, my Pasuk said if you could make a quarter of a turn with the ring, it's loose. If you can't, it's tight. My Pasuk said if you know. So what does that mean? You can't have a halacha that way. So the Ramah says, you know what? The halacha is you have rings. You take the rings off even if they're loose. You know why? Because we don't know what loose means. So therefore, you always take the ring off. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ubediyeved, also like Netila Barafui. But if you did wash the Netillas Yadayim with a ring on, if it's a loose ring, B'diyeved yoyotza. V'hu sheshafach alei revius babasachas. However, that's only true if you poured a revius of water onto the hand with the ring at one time. Like we're going to see later on in Siman Kuf Samach Beis Sif Tes, from a 30,000 foot level, what's going on over here is there's two different problems. One problem is the problem of the chatzitza. When it comes to the problem of the chatzitza, the Mishnah Berurah says that b'di'evid, if you washed Netillas Yadayim with a loose ring, so we're going to be mekel and we're going to say, okay, the water got under the ring and it's not a chatzitza. But there's another problem, and that's a tumah and tahara problem. Remember, we always say, when you wash the Netillas Yadayim with a revius b'basachas, the tumah on the hands goes poof. The tumah is gone. There's no more tumah. The water is not tumah. The water doesn't pick up the tumah off the hands. The tumah is gone. If, however, you wash less than a revius, then the water becomes tumah. That's why we always say, if you wash with less than a revius, you need to wash twice. Why? Because the first washing takes the tumah off the hands, and now the tumah is in the water. The second pour is mitaher the water. So that's why you need two washings if you wash with less than a revius. Problem is, with a ring, if you wash with less than a revius, a certain amount of water gets onto the ring. Now the water that's on the ring is considered tumah. It picks up tumah from the water that's on the hands. Now, you're going to wash a second time. The second time is going to be mitaher all the water that remains on your hand. But it cannot be mitaher the water that remains on the ring. Why? We'll see in Kuf Samach Beis. But now you have a problem. Now you're going to sit down to eat, and you have tamei water that's on the ring. So if you're gonna wash with a ring on, you gotta make sure to wash with a revius bebas achas. Now, ois cotton yud tes. And here we get to very, very critical. What's the gay all the time? For women that have rings, the gay all the time. The Mechaber said you got to take off the ring. The Ramah said you got to take off the ring even if the ring is loose. The Mishnah Berurah said, b'di'eved, if the ring was loose, you Hilchos Netillas Yadayim. Now, the big question is, I don't understand. Why do you got to take the ring off if you're not makpid? L'chayr, it's miut ve'enoi makpid. Miut ve'enoi makpid does not a chatzitza make. So why do you have to take the ring off? So the Ramah said, the reason you have to take the ring off, in the words of the Ramah, Hayil umakbid alav b'shah she'oisem melaka shelo yitanfu. Because people are makbid to take a ring off when they do work, so that the ring shouldn't get dirty. If you have something that there are specific times that you're makbid to take off, that's considered makbid. So first of all, we learn a very powerful lesson over here of what does it mean when we talk about miut umakbid. Like this, we could think miut umakbid means if you have dirt on your hand, you're makbid to take the dirt off. But a ring that you wear 99% of the time, and you're only makbid to take it off when you do work and you're afraid it's going to get damaged or get dirty, that's not called miut umakbid. No, you see, it is called miut umakbid. Now, what malacha are we talking about here? So let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah's cutting your tests. Umaski achreinim. The achreinim conclude that dafke isha, by a woman, shedarka lahakbid, where it's her way to be makbid, lahaser atabas, to take off her rings, b'shas malacha, when she does work, and now the Mishnah Berurah defines work, hainu b'shas lisha. A woman who kneads dough with her hands, kneads, K-N-E-A-D-S. A woman who makes challah, and she kneads dough with her hands. So if she's makbid to take her rings off when she kneads dough, so that means every Thursday or every Erev Shabbos, when she makes challah for Shabbos, she's makbid to take her rings off. So that means that there is a time, there is a zman mesugel, every week, when she's makbid to take her rings off, that renders the rings miut umakbid. But, says the Mishnah Berurah, this halacha that you have to take the ring off is only by a woman who has such a thing, that she's makbid to take her rings off b'shas lisha. Aval ish she'ein darka lahakbid la'asira b'shas malacha. But if a man has a ring, and he leaves it on all the time, and he never takes it off, even when he does work, kein darka lolush, because he doesn't need dough. I guess the thing of kneading dough is that the dough gets into the ring. But a man who doesn't need dough, and he's a carpenter, and he's not makbid to take his ring off, and he leaves his ring on all the time, ain't tzarek lo yisrael b'shas netila. He doesn't have to take his ring off at the time of Netillas Yadayim. Afilu emena rafui, even if it's not loose. Why? Because let it be tight. What do I care? It's a chatzitza. But it's a miut she'eina makbid. If it's a miut she'eina makbid, it's not a chatzitza. So a man who's not makbid to take his ring off, he could leave his ring on, even if it's a tight ring. Rakib yesh by even toiv, but if it has a precious stone, shegam ish darka lahakbid lahaseh b'shas netila shelo yislachlich ma'amayim, and then the man is makbid to take it off before Netillas Yadayim, not because of the halacha of chatzitza. He's makbid to take it off before Netillas Yadayim because he doesn't want to get it wet. So okay, so then he's makbid. Az yesh lachish la'asira b'shum chatzitza. What comes out from this halacha? Very interesting. You want to know if a woman, you see women all the time taking off their rings for the Netillas Yadayim, and then they're terrified. Oh no, I left my diamond. I don't know where it is. Do they really have to take it off? It depends. It depends. Do they have a zman mesugel that they're makbid to take their rings off? Do they take I know women who need dough with their rings on, and then before Pesach, they make sure to clean their rings because they're afraid that there might be chametz in their rings. So if they're not makbid to take their rings off, guess what? They don't have to take their rings off for the Netillas Yadayim. It's miut ve'ena makbid. They only have to take their rings off for the Netillas Yadayim if it's miut umakbid. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be made on Klal Yisrael. we are very much in need of Yeshuas. So the Rabbi Shalom should give us Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Gula Shlema, to be a Skal Tzedek b'Meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.